Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, ready to dive into something kinda heavy. We're talking dictators today.
Two big ones, Hitler and Castro.
And I gotta say, when I first heard we were gonna compare these two, I was like, huh.
Yeah.
German dictator, Cuban revolutionary.
Different continents.
Different everything. But then we dug into this episode from Mr. Hutchings History.
The rise of Hitler and Castro.
And wow, the parallels.
Yeah, some eerie parallels.
It's kind of freaky how two totally different crises can...
They can really create the perfect conditions for these powerful leaders to just...
Dangerous men
to rise up. And when we're talking about Hitler, you can't separate the man from what was going on in Germany.
Post-World War I Germany, talk about a recipe for disaster.
Humiliation, right?
Oh, yeah.
Stripped of their dignity.
The Treaty of Versailles just rubbing salt in the wound.
And forced to accept the blame for the war.
Like, here, take this economic depression on top of everything else.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting, because out of that humiliation, out of that economic despair, grows this need.
Someone to blame.
Yes.
Yeah.
Someone to blame, someone to lead them out of the darkness.
It's like, okay, if we're not responsible for our own downfall, which clearly they felt they weren't, then who is?
And that's where that stab in the back theory takes root. You know, the idea that Germany didn't actually lose the war. They were betrayed from within.
By their own people.
Politicians, communists, you name it.
Oh, man, talk about fanning the flames of resentment.
Exactly. And who's there to seize that anger, that resentment?
Hitler.
It's almost like he was waiting in the wings for the perfect moment.
You mean while you've got Cuba, right?
Cuba, a whole different world, literally. Yeah. But also under the thumb...
Batista.
The Batista regime,
Which was its own kind of mess.
It's crazy. You picture Cuba, you think paradise, right?
Right.
But underneath it all, there's this...
Yeah, corruption everywhere, social inequality just festering, and this underlying tension with America, with their influence.
Batista's dictatorship was like a powder keg waiting to explode. And both of these situations, completely different on the surface, they created this
big breeding ground
for these powerful, charismatic leaders to emerge. And they did.
Okay, so we've got our two pressure cookers ready to blow. Let's break down the ingredients, those factors that really led to these guys taking control.
Right, and the podcast does a great job of laying it all out, like step by step.
They even rank them, which I kind of love.
Yeah, and for Hitler, it all goes back to Versailles.
The Treaty of Versailles, I mean, I remember learning about it in school, but the podcast really brought home how deeply that treaty messed with Germany's sense of self.
Totally. You can't overstate the humiliation.
Yeah. To have to take the blame for World War I mean, I get why they were pissed.
Right. And then the reparations, having to pay all that money.
Oh, and don't forget about the disarmament. They basically had to strip their military down to nothing. Talk about a blow to their pride.
Totally. It was a national humiliation, like on a massive scale.
And Hitler, he was smart. He saw that anger, that resentment, and he weaponized it.
Oh, yeah. He used it. Turned the treaty into this symbol of everything wrong in Germany. We were betrayed. We were stabbed in the back. I can make Germany great again.
Masterful propaganda.
And it worked. People were desperate for someone to blame, someone to believe in.
It's kind of terrifying how effective that kind of rhetoric can be.
It is. Especially when you've got economic hardship on top of everything else.
Right, because it wasn't just wounded pride. Germany was on its knees economically.
Exactly. Imagine this. Germany's already struggling to recover from the war. Right. Then, bam, the Wall Street crash of 1929 hits.
The Great Depression.
Global economy tanks. And Germany, they get hit harder than most.
I can't even imagine. To go from one crisis straight into another, deeper one.
Unemployment skyrockets. People are losing their homes, their savings, everything they worked for.
So you've got this perfect storm brewing. Economic despair, national humiliation, this deep-seated need for a scapegoat.
And who comes along?
Hitler. With all the answers.
It's the Jews. It's the communists. Follow me and I'll make Germany great again.
Classic demagoguery.
And terrifyingly effective.
Yeah.
But even with all that going for him, Hitler couldn't have done it alone, right? The Weimar Republic itself played a part, didn't it? I mean, their government was...
It was a mess, like a house of cards.
Yeah, and Hitler was more than happy to.
Be a little blow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The podcast talks about how the Weimar Constitution was practically an open invitation for someone like Hitler to waltz right in and seize control.
It was incredibly flawed. For instance, proportional representation. Sounds good in theory, right? But it led to all these weak coalition governments.
Which meant nothing could get done.
Exactly. They were constantly fighting amongst themselves, so nothing got done. And then there was Article 48. Talk about a mistake. What was that one again?
Article 48 basically said that in times of emergency, the president could do pretty much whatever he wanted.
Well, that's a lot of power for one person.
Right. Talk about a recipe for disaster. And who was president at the time? Hindenburg.
Hindenburg. Wasn't he the one who basically handed Hitler the keys to the kingdom by appointing him chancellor?
The very same. And the irony is, the conservatives, they thought they could control him.
They thought they could use him for their own purposes and then just, like, toss him aside when they were done.
Yeah, big miscalculation.
Talk about an understatement.
It's almost hard to believe they were that naive. Almost.
And the rest, as they say, is history. But we can't talk about Hitler's rise without talking about his charisma.
Oh, yeah. The man knew how to work a crowd.
He was magnetic. I mean, obviously his message was abhorrent, but you can't deny he had this way of captivating people, of tapping into their deepest fears and desires.
He did. And he had Goebbels, his minister of propaganda, working behind the scenes.
The propaganda machine was just next level.
It's next level. They understood the power of repetition, of appealing to emotion over reason.
And it worked. Because as much as we hate to admit it, Nazi ideology resonated with a lot of people.
It did. It's a disturbing thought, but that's the reality. It was simple, it was powerful, and it offered scapegoats for all of Germany's problems.
It's not your fault you're suffering, it's theirs. I mean, what's scarier? That a monster like that can exist? Or that a society can be so broken that they embrace him?
It's a chilling thought, and it's something to think about even today, because the conditions that allowed Hitler to rise, they're not unique to 1930s Germany.
That's what's so scary.
It can happen anywhere, anytime.
Okay, so we've talked about Germany. Let's switch gears to Castro. His rise to power was a very different beast, wasn't it?
It was, but no less fascinating. And at the heart of it all is Fulgencio Batista.
Batista, talk about a leader who really paved the way for his own downfall.
Right. I mean, he was practically begging for a revolution.
So tell me, how did Batista's regime actually contribute to Castro's rise?
Well, imagine yourself living in Cuba in, say, the 1950s.
Okay, I'm imagining.
Batista's seized power in a coup.
Not a good sign.
No. And things are bad. The government is corrupt. There are American businesses everywhere. And they seem to have more say in what happens in Cuba than Cubans do.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that would breed some resentment.
Oh, big time. And on top of that, Batista's government is brutal. They don't care about the average Cuban, just about lining their own pockets.
So you're saying the seeds of revolution were already there?
Absolutely. Batista's regime was practically an open invitation for someone like Castro to step in and say, enough is enough.
It's amazing how often these dictators are their own worst enemies.
Right. It's like they can't see past their own greed and paranoia.
But it's interesting because unlike Hitler, who rose through this calculated manipulation of a broken system, Castro's rise seems much more organic.
You're right. And the podcast really emphasizes that. Castro rose through a genuine popular uprising.
He was a guerrilla leader, fighting in the mountains, rallying the people.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is how Batista's own corruption and brutality fueled that uprising. The podcast calls it the single most important factor in Castro's victory.
It makes sense, though. If you're living under a repressive regime, you're going to be a lot more sympathetic to the guy who's promising to overthrow it.
Exactly. Especially when that guy is also promising things like land reform and wealth redistribution.
Ah, yes. Tapping into those economic anxieties, always a winning strategy.
It is. And it's something that both Hitler and Castro did incredibly well. They understood that when people are afraid, when they're struggling, they're more likely to embrace extreme solutions.
Right. They're looking for a savior, someone to tell them that everything will be okay, even if that savior is, well, you know.
Exactly. And that's the danger, isn't it? We have to be careful who we put our faith in, especially during times of crisis.
Okay, but let's not forget about the elephant in the room, the United States. They had a huge presence in Cuba at the time. What role did they play in Castro's revolution?
Ah, yes. Uncle Sam. You can't talk about Cuba without talking about the U.S. I mean, they've been meddling in Cuban affairs for decades.
Yeah, it's not like the U.S. has the cleanest track record when it comes to Latin America.
Nope. Remember the Platt Amendment?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Basically, in 1901, the U.S. forced Cuba to add this amendment to their constitution.
And what did this amendment say?
Oh, just casual stuff, like giving the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever they felt like it.
Oh, is that all?
Yeah, and to lease or buy land for naval bases.
Subtle. I bet that went over well in Cuba.
You can imagine. It was basically a slap in the face to Cuban sovereignty.
So the U.S. was already deeply unpopular in Cuba by the time Batista came along.
Oh, yeah. And to make matters worse, American businesses had their hands in pretty much every major industry in Cuba. Sugar, utilities, you name it.
So Castro was smart to make anti-American sentiment a cornerstone of his revolution.
Oh, absolutely. He knew that tapping into that resentment would resonate with the Cuban people. And it did.
Get rid of Batista. Get rid of the Americans. Take back Cuba. I can see the appeal.
Right. It was a powerful message, especially for a nation that felt like it had been under someone's thumb for far too long.
It's amazing how often these things come down to national pride, isn't it?
It is. That need to be free, to control your own destiny. It's a powerful motivator.
And in Castro's case, it propelled him straight to the top.
He was a master at harnessing that energy, that frustration, that desire for change.
But he wasn't just some charismatic figurehead, right? I mean, he was a shrewd strategist, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He had to be. This was a revolution after all.
Right. So how did Castro actually win? What were his tactics?
Well, unlike Hitler, who was all about working within the system, Castro was a guerrilla fighter.
Right. He was fighting in the mountains with his band of revolutionaries.
Exactly. He understood that he couldn't take on Batista's forces head-on. So he used guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run tactics to wear them down.
And it worked.
It did. But what really made the difference was his ability to win over the Cuban people. He had this charisma, this aura of invincibility that drew people to him.
He was like a legend come to life.
Exactly. And he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. He fought alongside his men, shared their hardships. That earned him their loyalty, their respect.
He was one of them.
Exactly. He was the opposite of Batista, who was seen as this out-of-touch dictator who only cared about himself and his cronies.
So Castro's victory was about more than just military strategy. It was about winning hearts and minds.
Exactly. He gave the Cuban people hope.
Wow. It's incredible to think how two very different paths, two very different personalities led to essentially the same outcome.
It is. And it just goes to show you, power is a seductive and dangerous thing, no matter how you come by it.
And Batista wasn't exactly making things easy on himself, was he? By the late 50s, his grip on Cuba was...
Slipping. It was definitely slipping.
The podcast actually calls out his crumbling regime as a major factor in Castro's win. Like, his army wasn't exactly...
effective. Not at all. Morale was low, lots of deserters.
Yeah, who wants to fight for a leader who's basically robbed you blind? And when even the U.S. is like, okay, we're out, you know it's bad.
The writing was on the wall for Batista.
Yeah.
But Castro didn't just get lucky. He played this really smart game.
Finding the guerrilla stuff?
The hit-and-run tactics in the countryside.
With sabotage.
Right in the cities. A two-pronged attack.
So it's like he's hitting them where it hurts, but also messing with their heads. And while Hitler's using propaganda to create this, like, imaginary enemy, Castro's tapping into something very real in Cuba.
Social and economic injustice. It was everywhere.
Yeah, those inequalities we talked about, all those decades of, let's be honest, exploitation.
By Batista.
By the U.S.
Like a lot of Cubans feeling like
they didn't belong in their own country.
Exactly. Like their voices didn't matter. And Castro, he honed in on that.
Promised them what?
Land reform,
right.
Redistribution of wealth, a system that actually worked for them.
Not just for the Batista's cronies.
Exactly. It was a message that resonated, especially with the rural poor. They were really hurting.
Yeah, it's like this weird thing, right? Both Hitler and Castro, they used fear, resentment, that very human desire for something better.
To their advantage.
But it's different, right? Because Hitler, he's creating this external enemy.
Fabricating it.
But Castro's tapping into something that's already there.
Real pain, real anger.
Which is, I don't know, scarier in a way. Because it shows how those vulnerabilities exist in every society.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this stuff so relevant.
Yeah.
Because we tend to look at figures like Hitler and Castro as anomalies, right?
Monsters, dictators, the worst of the worst.
Right. But what the podcast does so well is it encourages us to look beyond the individuals, to recognize the warning signs.
Of a society that's primed for that kind of takeover. Okay, so what are the warning signs? Like, if we're being honest with ourselves, what should we be looking for?
It's not an exact science, of course. Every situation is unique.
Yeah.
But there are definitely some common threads. Economic hardship, huge one.
When people are struggling to survive, they'll listen to anyone who promises.
A quick fix. Doesn't matter how crazy the solution is if it promises to put food on the table.
And then you've got social division, which, let's be real, there's no shortage of that these days.
Yeah, that's like fuel on the fire, right? When a society is divided along racial, religious, economic lines,
It creates these cracks.
and demagogues, they're experts at exploiting those cracks. They thrive on division. It's classic divide and conquer.
And we can't forget about those external factors.
Oh, right, like with Hitler and the Wall Street crash, completely outside Germany's control, but
Totally played into his hands.
exactly. And with Castro,
The Cold War.
a global power struggle brewing, creating opportunities for someone like him to exploit.
Speaking of which, didn't Castro have some outside support for his revolution too? Like from other countries, groups? How big of a deal was that?
It's a good question. And historians, they still go back and forth on just how much those external factors really mattered. Castro definitely had relationships with leftist movements in other countries.
Right.
Got some aid, too. But most agree that it was the internal stuff, the stuff we've been talking about, that was the real driving force.
It was a homegrown revolution, which, in a way, makes it even more remarkable that he managed to hold on to power for so long.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? How do these larger-than-life figures, these strongmen, how do they manage to hold on year after year, decade after decade?
It's like they tap into something, right?
Some deep-seated need for a leader, a father figure even.
Especially during times of turmoil. And that's what's so unsettling about looking at these two, because you can't help but see
Parallel.
to our own world, you know? The political division, the economic uncertainty, it feels.
It's definitely a time for caution. History might not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes.
That's a chilling thought. Okay, but knowledge is power, right? And if we want to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, we have to understand how those mistakes happen in the first place. So let's dig into some of the different ways historians view these two. The podcast mentions something called the intentionalist school when it comes to Hitler. What's that all about?
Well, the intentionalists, they're laser focused on Hitler himself.
The man, the myth, the monster.
Exactly. They'd argue that his rise to power wasn't some fluke of history. It was a carefully crafted plan.
So he was gunning for dictatorship from the beginning.
Pretty much. They point to his writings, his speeches, even his early actions in the Nazi Party as proof that he was always working towards this goal. He wanted to dismantle the Weimar Republic from within, turn Germany into...
His vision.
His vision, exactly. 1,000-year right.
Talk about ambition. Okay, so the intentionalists see Hitler as this master manipulator, this evil genius who orchestrated his own rise to power.
Exactly. But, of course, not everyone buys that. There's another school of thought, the structuralists.
Okay, what's their take?
The structuralists, they're less interested in Hitler's personality and more interested in the context, the circumstances. They'd say it wasn't just Hitler, it was the system itself.
The Weimar Republic, with all its flaws.
Precisely. It was like this breeding ground for extremism. So the structuralists would argue that even without Hitler, someone else would have come along and exploited those weaknesses.
So in their view, he was more a product of his time than some uniquely evil mastermind.
Exactly. The economic crisis, the political instability, the social unrest, it all created this perfect storm that almost guaranteed a dictator would rise, Hitler or someone else.
So it's like a runaway train headed for disaster no matter who's at the controls.
That's a good way to put it, but it's not to say that Hitler wasn't responsible for his actions.
Right, right.
It's more about understanding that he didn't do it alone. There were larger forces at play.
It's a fascinating debate, but what about Castro? Were there similar arguments about his rise to power?
Oh, yeah. Just like with Hitler, historians have different perspectives on the Cuban Revolution.
So, break it down for us. What are the main camps when it comes to understanding Castro?
Well, you've got the revisionists on one hand. They challenge that traditional Cold War narrative that paints Castro as a communist puppet controlled by the Soviets.
Right, because for a long time, the West saw Castro as a pawn in the Cold War chess game.
Exactly. But the revisionists, they dig deeper. They argue that while the Cold War definitely played a role, it wasn't the whole story.
There was more to it than just the Soviets made him do it.
Way more. The revisionists stress that Castro's revolution was rooted in real grievances against Batista, against American imperialism. They point to the corruption, the inequality, the deep resentment towards the U.S.
So they're bringing it back to those internal factors, saying that Castro didn't create this revolution out of thin air. He was riding a wave of discontent that was already building.
Exactly. And they argue that if we focus only on the Cold War, we miss a huge part of the picture.
We miss the Cuban people.
Exactly. Their struggles, their aspirations, their desire for a better future.
So, depending on who you ask, Castro was either a communist stooge or a homegrown liberator.
In a nutshell, yes. But of course, it's more nuanced than that. You can't completely ignore the Cold War context either. And that's where another school of thought comes in.
Right, because even if Castro's revolution started as a purely Cuban affair, it quickly became part of this much bigger global struggle.
Exactly. And that's where you have historians who place Castro's rise squarely within that Cold War context.
So for them, Castro's a player on the world stage, using the U.S.-Soviet rivalry to his advantage.
Exactly. They'd say his embrace of communism wasn't just ideological, it was strategic.
A way to get Soviet support, to stick it to the Americans?
And to solidify his own power.
It's fascinating how history can be interpreted in such different ways.
Isn't it? It reminds us that there are always multiple perspectives, multiple ways of understanding the past. And it's our job to grapple with those different perspectives, to weigh the evidence and draw our own conclusions.
It's like piecing together this giant, complex puzzle where the pieces don't always fit neatly.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting. It keeps us on our toes, challenges our assumptions.
And speaking of challenging assumptions, one thing that really struck me about this podcast was how it humanized Hitler and Castro, you know?
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, I mean, obviously what they did was horrific.
Of course.
But hearing about the context, the factors that led to their rise, it's hard not to see them as, well, human, flawed, ambitious, power-hungry, sure, but still human.
I see what you mean. It's easy to write them off as monsters, but the truth is, they were men. Men who made terrible choices with devastating consequences.
And that's almost scarier, isn't it? Because it means that this kind of darkness, this capacity for evil, it's not limited to some mythical monsters, it's within all of us.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one.
It really is, because if we want to prevent this kind of history from repeating itself, we have to understand that it could happen anywhere, anytime.
Exactly. We can't afford to be complacent. We have to be vigilant, protect those things that safeguard us against tyranny.
It's like, how do we make sure we're not accidentally creating those conditions today?
Right. It's a question we should all be asking.
We were talking about how Hitler and Castro, they both exploited crises, but their methods were totally different.
Night and day.
Hitler, he was like a wolf in sheep's clothing, using the system to dismantle it from the inside.
A very calculated approach. Remember, he rose through the ranks of the Nazi Party, became chancellor legally.
And then boom, dictatorship.
It's a cautionary tale about the fragility of democracy, how easily it can be manipulated, eroded from within.
Whereas Castro, he was more like a bull in a china shop.
More of a grassroots movement, for sure.
Yeah, fueled by this very real anger, this desire for radical change.
And you can't underestimate how powerful that kind of energy can be, especially when it's channeled by someone as charismatic as Castro.
So different paths, same destination dictatorship, makes you wonder, can a revolution, even for the right reasons, ever really stay true to its ideals?
It's the ultimate question, right? How do you go from overthrowing an oppressive regime to actually building a just and equitable society?
And how do you prevent power from corrupting the people in charge?
Exactly. Because power, it changes people. It's a slippery slope.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've looked at the factors that allowed Hitler and Castro to rise, the different ways historians interpret their legacies, those fascinating parallels.
And the really stark differences.
What's the takeaway? What do you want our listeners to remember from this whole deep dive?
For me, it's about recognizing that history isn't just a bunch of dates and names.
It's not just some boring textbook stuff.
Right. It's about real people making real choices, often in really difficult circumstances.
And those choices have consequences.
Huge consequences. And it's by understanding those choices, that context, that we could hopefully make better choices today.
Avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. So learn from history, folks, because, it's not like it's going anywhere.
And never underestimate the power of critical thinking. Always question. Always be wary of those who claim to have all the answers.
Especially during times of crisis, because those are the times when we're most vulnerable, most susceptible to those authoritarian impulses. And that's true whether you're in 1930s Germany, 1950s Cuba, or 2020s.
Anywhere.
Anywhere. Stay vigilant, everyone. And until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.